So this week we have a new topic. We're going to be talking about risk. Risk is something that on one level we don't want to talk about. We want to talk about it, but we really don't. Not always. People don't like to talk about things that could go wrong. And they rather talk about things that will go right and positive things and keeping, hope there, hoping that things are going to work out. But if we're going to be effective at meeting our compliance objectives, we need to talk about risk. The idea of risk and compliance coming together is becoming really important, and we're starting to see that more and more. In certain domains, it's already there. Certainly when regarding safety, compliance and risk really do go hand in hand. Other areas, it's more separated. But today, what I want to do is I want to give you a bit of a background on what risk is all about, because this topic has evolved over the last number of years, let's say, and it's changed, and it's changed in some really exciting and important ways. The way that we thought about risk is perhaps different than the way we think about them now. We always like to have definitions, so we're going to go with this one. The ISO standard guideline 31,000, it's on risk management. This is how they define risk. It's the effects of uncertainty on objectives. This has become pretty much the de facto standard for risk. It's quite amazing. If you look at ISO 9000, they've adopted a very similar one, the effects of uncertainty on unexpected outcomes. If you look at project management, they have a similar definition for risk. And almost all across the board, this is becoming the way that people are now considering risk. And so it's worthwhile that we spend a little bit of time unpacking what uncertainty means and what are the objectives and how do they work together. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the objectives first, and then I'm going to slowly introduce the concept of uncertainty. This was kind of our diagram that we talked about at base camp. This is our mountain that we're climbing, a hierarchy of obligations. It begins with accepting legal responsibility and moves up until accepting stakeholder responsibility. And as you move further up the mountain, things change at each level. At one point you're talking about complying to prescriptive things, and then you're trying to conform to standards, and then you're trying to be proactive and actually get to certain targets, to zero emissions and zero breaches and zero violations. And at some point you're trying to get to some kind of measure of stakeholder value, in the terms of environmental sustainability and governance, as they're now calling it. So this is kind of the mountain of obligations. And it looks like a triangle, a cone, let's say. As we go up, we find that we need to take on increased responsibility. And we talked about this at base camp, and I would encourage you to go back to that and go and review that on your own. But there's something else that we notice, and maybe you've noticed this too, is that with every ascent, every level that you go up the mountain, there seems to be an increased level of uncertainty. At one point at the bottom, it's easy to be certain about whether you're meeting a particular obligation or a requirement. If it's prescriptive, it's easy to check for that. You can audit it. You could check your boxes, and you'll know what your status is, and you could say for certain that you're complying, and that's fine. But when you get closer to the top, how do you know that you're making progress towards zero emissions? That you have the capabilities to do that, and do you have the right objectives, and are you going to get there? Are you going to make it? Well, you don't know that for certain. There's some level of uncertainty about that. And it comes to stakeholder value and measuring that's not easy to do. And there's a lot of uncertainty to go with that. And so the triangle gets inverted. And this actually has a name. We call this the cone of uncertainty. It's the cone of uncertainty. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But this uncertainty, It creates the opportunity for risk. Uncertainty creates the opportunity for risk. And this is right from the definition. We know that uncertainty has an effect on the things that we want to achieve. If we tilt the mountain on its side, maybe this will make it a little easier for us. We choose to walk rather than climb the mountain. At the beginning, on the left-hand side, an interesting place to start. It's the beginning of every objective. It's the beginning of every obligation that you want to achieve. It's the beginning of every plan. Well, it's the beginning of every initiative. And the thing about beginnings, it's all about possibilities. Anything can happen at the beginning when there's time to get into trouble. It's time to fail. It's time to succeed. There's time. But you have lots of possibilities. Anything is possible. And of course, that's the problem. Too many things are possible. What we want to do is, as we move across to the outcome, the thing that we're trying to achieve, and we do that through going through objectives, what we want is we want to be more certain that we achieve the outcome that we want, and rather than all the other possibilities, right? And that's the goal. It's like the goal of every plan. What the purpose of risk management is. It's to make certain that you achieve your outcome. That's what it's trying to do, and that's what we're trying to do when we think about risk when it comes to obligations. We want to make sure we meet the objectives, and those objectives are producing the outcomes that we hope for. But we don't hope for these things only. I mean, hope is a wonderful thing. We need a lot of hope in our lives, right? But what we know is that hope is not a good strategy when it comes to risk and uncertainty. We can do something about it. And the way that risk management works is it does two things. And this is relatively new. It comes from different, if you think about safety, there's a lot of safety one, safety two thinking here. We're trying to do two things. We're trying to reduce the probability of the unintended outcomes, and at the same time, increase the probability of the intended outcomes. It's the two towers, let's say, of risk management. And we didn't know that before. We only tend to focus on the one thing, which was to reduce the probability of the unintended outcomes, loss, dealing with loss. But what we have to do is we have to do the other thing too, is we actually have to increase the probability of actually achieving the outcome itself. And that is, you can call that pursuing opportunities, where the other one is trying to protect against loss. So that's how the cone of uncertainty works when we're trying to converge, be more certain as we go across through time. It can represent the status of our risk in a number of different ways. Here is a heat map. But the thing that you probably will notice here is, well, you have likelihood on one side and we have impact on the other. Likelihood has a measure of uncertainty. It's the effects of uncertainty, right? So we need to measure uncertainty. And what we try to do is we compare that to the impact, which is a measure of the effect on the objective. We can evaluate both things and we end up with a matrix of things which have high probabilities or high likelihoods, and things which are high impact, and those would be the red zone. And that's on the left-hand side, and that's about avoiding losses, and a lot of people have done that. And if you look at most risk registers, that's probably what you're going to find, is going to find a likelihood and an impact statement, and you're going to multiply those two together, perhaps in a quantitative way, pseudo-quantitative. Let's say it's not really quantitative. But what about the right-hand side? That's new. Well, it shouldn't be, but it's new for a lot of people, and that's the other side of the equation. That's saying, okay, well, we can avoid losses, but we also need to advance outcomes, right? You can't get to zero emissions by just avoiding losses in compliance and not in non-conformance. You actually have to increase capabilities, pursue opportunities to get to a better, higher level of performance. And so that's a different side of the equation, and that's there too, both sides, two towers. So that's a little bit about risk. We're going to come at it from a number of different sides, like we did the mountain of obligations. When I introduce uncertainty, I like to use the story of the Lord of the Rings, and I don't have time to really tell the story today, but if you're interested, we may be able to do that at another time. But this is at the very beginning of their adventures, and it's a statement that's made by Gandalf, one of the wizards, and he says to one of the hobbits, he says, "It's a dangerous business walking out of one's front door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to. You're leaving the world of certainty, your home, and stepping into a world of uncertainty." And well, isn't that more true today than it's ever been with COVID? Not with COVID and people hunkering down in the trenches of their homes, and stepping outside seems to be, well, taking your life at your own hands. And so, maybe the statement has a lot to teach us. But one thing that it does teach us that everything happens in the presence of uncertainty. Right? There's nothing that happens with complete certainty. So the problem is we just don't know how much uncertainty we have. And as I mentioned before, uncertainty creates the opportunity for risk. This is kind of like the dragon in the story of Lord of the Rings, and dragons are very interesting, and because they're unpredictable. They are uncertain, but they have something to teach us. They have gold. There's something that we want. And so it's not all negative. So the dragon of uncertainty may actually have something that's an opportunity for us, not just a negative thing. So there's a lot to teach us about that. But there's something that I do want to cover because this is really important. I'm going to properly contend with risk. We never manage risk. We contend with risk. We handle risk. We treat risk. We never manage it. It's never that certain. It's always strategies that we put in place. And there's two sides to this. One side would call this allegatory uncertainty. And it has to do with the fact that things are just random. There's variability in lots of things in life, and processes have a lot of variability. If you're doing Lean Six Sigma, they spend most of their time trying to reducing common variability. And that's important when you're dealing with quality. But it does describe a lot of the things that happen in the world and within businesses. It's just chance. And we call this irreducible uncertainty because we can't do anything about it. There isn't any more we can do about this risk. It's other than to guard against it. And we call those margins. And that's the treatment, that's the strategy. And well, this from a compliance perspective, for sure, because margins are things like insurance, coverage. You get insurance to cover allegatory uncertainty. The chance that your house might go on fire, your business might collapse, or you might get, sued by someone. So there's all kinds of things that could happen that you're uncertain about, and it's not something you can do anything about the uncertainty, but you can protect yourself. So you may need extra reserves, extra money, extra insurance to cover yourself. You need a buffer in order to have the resiliency that you need to recover. So when something bad happens, like certainly with COVID, it has gone through probably a lot of people's savings if they've lost their jobs. Those savings are their margin against allegatory uncertainty, which is what the pandemic has been for us. It's an example, and it exists within compliance as well. You need some guardrails. You need some things to protect you from going offside because of unpredictable things. But there's another side of uncertainty, and has to do, it's called epistemic uncertainty. It has to do with knowledge and a lack of knowledge. And this is where a lot of our uncertainty resides. Although both parts, allegatory and epistemic, exist, usually within a particular compliance obligation. But lack of knowledge is what is concerned here. And we describe this using probabilities and likelihoods as well. We can predict the outcome of these ones. You can use heat maps and things like that. So when you see a heat map or you see a probability curve, in a sense, you know we're talking about epistemic uncertainty. And you can do something about this. You can reduce the uncertainty by knowing more, right? You can do tests. You can figure things out, right? You can improve your capabilities. You can do things to buy this down. And so what you want to do is you want to, again, this is the cone of uncertainty comes into play here, is that when things guard against the things you don't want to see happen, and you want to make sure, and the word make sure is a very interesting one. We use the word ensure to say that. And that's what we do to buy down, invest in the controls and the risk measures to ensure that we get the objective met and we get the outcomes that we want. Two kinds of uncertainty. There you go. There's much more we could say about that, but it gives you an idea of the strategies that you might use to contend with risk. And today we're not talking about the strategies. What we're trying to do here is just identify the risks. And before we get into that, well, you're going to discover that there's just so many of them. There's all kinds of risks. There's more risks than you can possibly contend with, right? You can never have enough protection, let's say, guardrails, margin, and you can never have enough money, time, or knowledge to contend with all the risks that are out there. So you have to figure out which ones really matter. So when you have a list of obligations and you're trying to prioritize your efforts, you're going to have some way of figuring out what risks really you need to be focused on. And not all of them matter. Not all of them do. Because the ones that do, well, we go back to the definition. It's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So the risks that matter are connected with the objectives that we're trying to achieve. So you don't have to fight every dragon. Only the dragon that has the gold that you want, right? That's your goal. That's your objective, is that dragon, not the other 20 that are somewhere else. So being clear about your objectives are really critical to being able to focus on the risks that really matter. And of course, when we talked about that, you're going to need a strategy. You can't just kind of jump into it and hope for the best. You need an approach. You need a strategy to win. And well, there's been lots of strategies out there in lots of different ways to talk about risk. And behind this is a risk management map. It's very interesting. But all of these are to some degree outdated now. It's an old map. Things have changed. The way we treat risk has to deal with treating the uncertainty rather than the effects of uncertainty, let's say. That would be one way of saying it. And we do that two ways, right? I alluded to this at the beginning, is that we avoid failure. That's still something we need to do. We need to protect against failure. We need to have the guardrails in place. We need to pay attention to what might cause failure, right? So you could do a root cause analysis, let's say, and there's a causal effect in place, maybe. And you need to look at what could go wrong. And that's all good stuff. And you need to come up with a list of what could go wrong. Why might you not achieve your objectives on your compliance? How do you know? How could you find out that the strategy that you have is failing? You need a better strategy, right? Most people don't know that. They don't know the effectiveness of the risk measures. So that's another conversation to have. But you want to be able to do that. But there's that other side, there's the other tower of risk, and it's to make sure that we focus on the opportunities and that we are effective and that we not only comply with certain things, but we also get the outcomes that we're hoping to get, the benefits from being in compliance. Like, wouldn't that be wonderful, right? And to say that there's actually a return on investment in our compliance, right? It's not just a cost, it's not just an expense, it's actually something that produces benefits that are recurring, that are cumulative, that add on top of each other over time. It's actually important when you get a hold of this, that set up the conditions to improve your probability of success, right? That's important too. But as I mentioned, we don't like talking about it. I'm going to go very quickly through here just to keep track of time here. But there's lots of different perspectives that you might have on risk, right? And different mindsets that you can have. And I would say that after working in the risk field for so many years, most people fit into the left-hand side, the ostrich. They're sticking their heads in the sand. They just don't want to know about it. Just don't tell me. Don't tell me what the risk is, right? And what happens when that occurs is that you're tolerant of risk. You're basically saying, I'm willing to accept whatever happens, happens. Call it fate, call it something else if you like, right? And that's one view. You're not doing risk management then. If that's the case, you're just accepting whatever happens, and that's not good for businesses. So people have other perspectives here. Some people avoid risk, which means they don't take any action that is risky at all to them. And businesses couldn't succeed if that's the case either. And some people are more neutral. It doesn't matter. Could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. We're just gonna, work that out. And some people are gambling they just play the odds. And they're very risk-seeking. They like risk, and they probably like it too much. And you don't want to gamble your business either. So what's best? What's really the right answer here? And it's something that we've come to this conclusion over the last few years, is risk is nothing more than creating a strategy that optimizes your conditions for success. That's really what it is. Putting the steps in place to improve your probability of success. And so you're a strategist, and that's what you're really focusing on. So, which perspective do you have? Right? Where do you sit on this line? I hope you're more on the right-hand side than on the left. Even if you have a positive view of risk and that you want to use it to improve your probability of success, you want to contend with it, you are going to have difficulties in even finding the risks. This is one of the more complicated things in risk management. We have blind spots, we have biases, right? One of the things that I might have is I have an optimistic bias, is that I tend to think things are going to work out, right? And nothing goes wrong, right? And well, that's not good sometimes, right? Things do go wrong, and I need to be able to see those. But I have a cognitive bias that always looks for the opportunities rather than the threats. Now, other people, they might have the other one, which is that all they see are threats, right? And that's all they see, right? So biases can get in the way, priorities get in the way. Black swans, if you haven't heard about black swans, it's the unknowable risk. It's the thing we didn't plan for, we didn't account for, we couldn't even predict, we didn't even know it was there until it happened. Right? Some people have said that COVID-19 is a black swan, but it's not. We knew about it. It's predictable. We just didn't do anything about it. So you have some things that are going to challenge your ability to find these things. You can work through all the different challenges. But for our purposes today, what we want to do is we want to focus in on where we typically find the dragons of uncertainty and where we find risk. And And we find them in three places. We find them inside our businesses, inside our processes, our systems, our programs. I'm going to show you that in a moment very quickly. Manifest themselves externally. There are things that happen to us, changing conditions. Of course, COVID-19 pandemic has been a huge extrinsic risk on corporations and organizations and has affected every aspect of a business, some to greater degree than others, but they've been impacted. The more difficult one is the emerging risk, which is the effects of change has on making things that were once hidden now visible, right? And I'll show you how that works too very quickly. You have a number of layers of defense, right? So you have a set of barriers that protect yourself. These are layers of defense against the effects of uncertainty on your obligations. And these are some of them, not all of them, but these are the most important ones to some degree. You have regulations themselves, right? They're from the government, they're there to protect against public harm. There's industry standards, there's your own internal strategic objectives, there's your governance processes, there's policies, there are your management programs and systems. You've got managers, people, supervisors, you've got internal processes, you've got standard operating procedures, you've got frontline workers, and all of them contribute to buying down risk. That's one way to look at it. And, well, you're going to have gaps. And, well, those things are there, and you need to know where those gaps are. So maybe that's something you need to look at when you're identifying risk is, do you have enough coverage in your regulations? Effective implementation of industry standards? Do you have proper oversight and governance? Do your frontline workers understand the risks that they're taking on and have proper safe work procedures, let's say, or know how what they're doing is impacting the environment? Things of that nature. There's lots that you can look at here. And a threat may happen and may punch through one of your vulnerabilities, but it ends up being handled by another and you avoid it. So it doesn't punch right through. But, there are these things called dragons. And one of the dragons we have is the effects of uncertainty as a result of change. And so we may change something, and a good example here is a strategic objective, may change that. You might go, well, it's just a small change. It's not a big one. But what it did is it moved it and it exposed a vulnerability that was perhaps always there, but now is exposed. We call them latent vulnerabilities. And if you look at James Reason, who's with the Swiss cheese model, then you know where I'm coming from here. And what happens here is you now created the opportunity for a threat to punch right through. And people are really surprised by these ones. And it happens all the time, right? It's like, well, that was a small change. It shouldn't have been much of an impact. Why did we end up with an explosion? Right? And that's why. So this is kind of an emergent risk as a result of change. We're nearly there. So we talked about uncertainty, and risk as being the effects of uncertainty on objectives. And our objectives have to do with meeting our obligations. We want to be able to connect these together, put them into our registers in such a way that we can now properly contend with the risk. And so this is going to lead up to your challenge for the next week, challenge number 4. And for this, I'm going to introduce something called the qualified risk statement. So this is a schema, let's say, for how you can define risk. It's not just a number. We'll get to the numbers in a moment, but it is a qualitative description of the effects of uncertainty on objectives. And this is how we do it. We use this particular format. We call risk in this way. We state it in this way. We say, as a result of a particular action or condition, some event or particular event may occur. That's the uncertainty, right? That's the uncertainty. We need to have a number for that, which would lead to an effect on the objectives, right? And we always need an action or condition to instigate an event, right? We know that you can have a flammable fuel, flammable gas. We don't get an explosion until we put a flame or ignition source in the flammable gas, right? It's the action that then caused the explosion to occur. We need those two things to come together. So here's what you can do this week: is to add some risk columns to your internal obligations register. And it looks like this. We're going to send you the slides so you have this. But I'll go through the first one here to give you an example. We have an obligation, and it's to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions by 5% by 2023. That's our commitment. And we've got a number of objectives, perhaps, and here's one of them, which is to install the carbon dioxide scrubber on the primary stack. Right? That would help to scrub out that carbon dioxide. That would be good. Okay. So that's the objective, that's the obligation. Now we've identified a risk. And the first one is a threat. And it's stated this way, and it says, as a result of new leadership, maybe we're anticipating that leadership is changing. Priorities may change. That's the uncertainty, leading to a cancellation of the scrubber project. We know that happens. Projects get canceled all the time when there's new priorities. So, well, you need to account for that. And so you might then quantify what's the likelihood of new leadership happening and that they're going to cancel the scrubber project, right? And you can come up with a number between 1 to 5, let's say, maybe call it 3 in this case, so somewhat moderately in the middle. And what's the impact? Well, if you cancel the scrubber project, that has a huge impact. So we go all the way to 5. You multiply those two together, you get the risk level, which is 15. And that gives you a measure of the effects of uncertainty on objectives. It's the quantitative number that describes the qualitative risks. And you can go through each one of these and you can see that we have other examples, that there's different kinds of effects, right? As a result of, here's a positive, here's an opportunity. As a result of new climate adaptation targets, priorities may change, leading to greater commitment to the scrubber project. Well, that could happen too, and that would actually work for you and improve your probability of the scrubber being put in place. And so you could quantify that and come up with a different number, right? And that's a risk as well because it's uncertain, but it has a positive effect on your objectives. And you have to take both into account, threats and opportunities. Threats and opportunities. Okay, your next challenge.